Hello. Welcome to my video series discussing a secondary world of mine and the creatures therein. Arthrome is a high fantasy setting that I've been working on for a long time. I've been eager to discuss the world, and so these videos serve as an ideal space to talk about some of the visual components of the setting that I hope you will find interesting. In today's video, I'll be returning to the Warborn ghosts of Arthrome, examining the history of the creatures, and exploring one of their named characters, a Warborn spirit named Rancor Tyrannis. I'll be exploring his origins, his design, my developmental process, and Rancor's role within the story of the world. If you are at all interested and would like to know more about the Warborn spirits of Arthrome, then please refer to the link in the video description. In the meantime, let's discuss Rancor Tyrannis, First Officer of the 13th Expeditionary Brotherhood, and the Red Cockerel of the Heraced Campaign. The Warborn of Arthrome are classified as ethereal spirits, an order of creatures defined as beings which manifest as nature's direct response to the actions of mortal people. In the case of the Warborn, they manifest in the scarred fields of old battles, appropriating the image of the men and women that died there. Their purpose is to serve as living reminders of the conflict, so that the inconsolable loss of life is never forgotten and never repeated. The Warborn are my setting's answer to ghosts as a typical fantasy archetype. I have previously published a video all about the Warborn that you can find a link to in the description of this video. If you would like to know more about the thought process and decision making that went into the design of the Warborn ghosts, then I would suggest referring to that video, as I go into a lot more depth with the subject. That said, I will try to provide a quick summary of my thoughts on ghosts, as it will largely serve as context for the design of Rancor Tyrannis. For me, ghosts are a vague umbrella term, in the same way that wraith and spirit can be used to generalise an undead phantom. That said, I think there is one aspect to ghosts that neatly sets them apart and makes them appealing from a design and narrative perspective. For me, what distinguishes the ghost story from other kinds of spirit is how ghosts are often viewed as unnatural and unnerving. Ghosts lingering in the world after death is largely portrayed as an undesirable state of affairs. They are often antagonistic, or are wrought into being by something terrible, existing as a reminder. It is very normal for us to revere and venerate our deceased ancestors, yet with ghosts, this air of reverence is replaced with unease and fear. And it is this that I feel feeds into their popularity as an archetype in ghost stories and gothic horror. This energy to ghosts that I've identified served as the backbone for the iterative development of my Warborn and informed a lot of my decision making. I've designed these creatures quite a few times now, with my desired image of them changing with my evolving tastes, interests, and personal development as an artist. At one point, they were visually rather understated, appearing like armoured men-at-arms, with warped and lithe proportions. At a certain point, I decided that this was too understated, and didn't really convey anything meaningful, and so I pushed for more supernatural elements with a more updated design. This one worked pretty nicely, and introduced some elements to the Warborn that have stuck around. Firstly, the soldiers of my world are equipped with very different armour and weapons than that of ours, and so I used this design as a vehicle to illustrate that. Additionally, I gave this design more deathly motifs that repeat throughout the creature to make it feel like a type of undead. And finally, I included a veil descending from the head that is stamped with a number of coins denoting how old the individual was when they died. However, while I saw potential in this design, an important feature of the Warborn is that they are living visual reminders of any and all civilians and soldiers killed in battle, and therefore they shouldn't necessarily be too characterful on an individual level. A single Warborn shouldn't appear too cool, as their theming is that of the everyman. This design works well, but is ultimately a touch too visually intense and characterful to fit the theming of the Warborn as a spirit. As such, with my newer designs, I decided to make the Warborn appear more understated, with mundane weapons and armour. With these newer iterations, the subject of interest that defines the Warborn spirit, and ultimately helps them to feel distinct within the roster of creatures I've designed up to this point, is the supernatural elements surrounding them. I mentioned before that what is important about ghosts is the unnerving feeling that they represent. To this end, each Warborn spirit is accompanied by an ethereal hand that coalesces from Empyrean energies spilling off from the creature's form. This suspended hand seems to manipulate the Warborn spirit and ultimately control it, feeding into this idea that the spirit isn't really the individual who died, but a poorly recalled representation of them, conjured into being by this strange hand. The exact nature of this manifestation surrounding the Warborn isn't understood, but visually it does unify them, and so it became a prominent feature of my newer iterations of the Warborn ghosts. This unifying trait means that each drawing of the Warborn can be largely unique, wearing the trappings of the factions that these soldiers hail from, whilst always being recognisable as a Warborn spirit. Rancor was a human commander from the Triandane War who garnered an unfortunate reputation for failed campaigns and petty victories, coming at the cost of lives that the armies of mankind couldn't afford to lose. Unlike my typical design process, where I consider a range of iterations before settling on a defined look, Rancor's design came right off the back of my previous Warborn drawings. At the time, I began to doodle fun ideas for a mounted Warborn knight, until I realised that what I was drawing had some fun potential. So, while Rancor's design isn't as well justified as what I typically produce, I'm overjoyed with how he came out. With that in mind, let me share some insight into the history of Rancor Tyrannis, First Officer of the 13th Expeditionary Brotherhood and the Red Cockerel of the Heraced Campaign. Dear Quarter Revenum Lex, apologies, sir. I don't mean to swamp you with hails. I have taken some paid work recently, and I've come to realise that, well, our order is one of a scholarly disposition, grasping with the primordial truth. Now, before you lose faith in me and the discipline of your teaching, understand that I largely wanted to punctuate this letter with something that might grab your attention. I know full well that guild lecturer is time-consuming work, and no doubt you're up to your eyes in admin. That said, if you have a moment, I invite you to read along and to gauge my recent experiences and the revelations therein. You see, I have the ambition to publish a thesis, and I really would value your input. As I said, I've been working. When mounting rumours of trouble in Ahoriel reached my ears 2 months ago, I thought I'd be a fool to miss the action. I spent nearly a third of the year's earnings on travel alone, just so I could get to Castle Silverarch in time to be of some service to our newly appointed High King. By the time that I arrived, the troubles in the north, well, it seems that they might have resolved themselves, and I, for lack of a better word, looked a complete fool. Worse than that, I was broke. The expenses of my travel were mortifying, and it doesn't help that my troubles cost me nearly 2 horses. The rest of my funds, regrettably, are at home with you and the others. Of course, if I only spoke up about my plight, I'm sure the guild hall in Castle Silverarch could have afforded me some credit, at least for the journey home. But then, as I'm sure you know, sir, when it comes to the roadblock of my pride, my silence on the matter was a foregone conclusion. Regardless, the emptiness of my pockets painted a rather clear picture. I needed work. The Silverarch Guild Hall referred me to Montanelm, and, after a short stint between cities, I was able to pick up a few contracts. As it turns out, the Catsfield and its western reaches are still, to this day, swarming with werewolves, even after all these years. Of course, there are fewer of them now than there were before, largely thanks to our order, and some adjacent parties. On that note, I had queried my supervisors about Sothnok. I didn't anticipate fighting the beast. I mean, come on, I'm not that kind of fool. But I was curious if it still lives. And it doesn't. It seems he was slain by mercenaries, a group known as the Kind Fool's Company. You know, it's curious. I've heard that name cropping up a lot as of late. When I heard that Sothnok had been slain by common mercenaries, as opposed to distinguished veterans of our order, I could hardly staunch a chuckle. I laughed to the disdain of my supervisor, no doubt, though he didn't voice any such grievance. In truth, I was relieved. I didn't want to chance the Catsfield alone if that monster still roamed the foothills. But, since it doesn't any longer, the others of his ethereal pack, well, they were fair game, at least as far as I was concerned. And so I set off again, armed with silver, and prepared for a jaunt through the foothills. I quickly discovered that the trek was less than accommodating. The patchwork of forests, rivers, and moorland that lays between Montanelm and Catamhome comes to about 65 miles from point A to point B. And that's without taking into account that I was hardly moving in a straight line. Of course, I could have followed the Great Gillinell River and its accompanying stone-paved road if expediency was my goal. But that's the thing, right? I mean, I've yet to encounter a werewolf to do us mortals the common courtesy of keeping in view of our well-laden trails. No, my quarry wouldn't be so readily available. I went off-road, traipsing back and forth about the open country, trying my best to stay near enough to civilization so that I could guarantee every third night would be enjoyed resting in the heat of a cushioned inn. I'll be honest, the homely comforts certainly came at the expense of a job well done. My prey was out there, and I would find it at my own pace. It was then, on one night of many, that as I sat there, staring into the contents of a quickly emptying flagon, that a man came and sat across from me. I was sitting at a table that could accommodate up to about 6 people, and every other table in the inn was so close to packed that it was inevitable that I would be joined by a stranger, to my chagrin. I forget his name, but I could tell that he had spent the day off-road just as I had. We began speaking, eventually. He had clearly recognised that I was a hunter of the guild, and he wanted my expertise regarding a subject he clearly knew very little about, and was rattled by, for lack of a better word. The man had encountered a phantom while he was crossing the old, war-scarred territories at the base of the mountain slopes. The creature had resembled a knight on horseback, yet different, and it signalled its presence with a commander's war horn. It had been charging with the speed of desperation, and were it not for the blaring of the horn, its approach might have spelled the doom for the man sitting across from me. He continued, and was clearly more disturbed by the horn than the fact his life had been so dangerously close to being stamped out under the footfalls of some ethereal stallion. Then I learned he was superstitious, and I knowingly rolled my eyes. He was worried that the sounding of an isolated war horn heard by him and him alone meant that he had been cursed by the phantom, seeing his encounter as an ill omen that foretold of his demise. I rolled my eyes again. Once I had successfully calmed the man's nerves and shooed him away, I ruminated on his description of the phantom. You'll be glad to know that even without the watching gaze of a supervisor or a fellow hunter, I did take the matter seriously. I assumed it was one of those manifestations known to appear around long-dead battlefields. I understood that our order calls them Warborn. Yes, well, this Warborn certainly matched the physical descriptions of our accounts. The man I had spoken to had been rather precise in articulating the specifics of the creature's appearance. He'd even written it down. It was then, as I was reading and rereading the description, that it dawned on me. This Warborn spirit, well, it was alone, and it was a commander. The man I had spoken to confirmed this. There had been no sign of phantom infantry or cavalry in the man's peripheral. It was just this lonesome commander, which, as I understand, is a first. I mean, you can confirm this. Usually, the Warborn appear en masse, within the spaces where soldiers and civilians are killed in battle, vaguely resembling those that had died, if I remember rightly. They have never appeared as strictly single individuals, and, well, this raised my professional curiosity, and I was eager to pursue an answer. So, following the man's directions, I walked out into the wilderness the next day to see if I could find this lost ghost. I had been told that the encounter happened near to the middlemost western fork that branches into the greater Gillinell River. This was accurate, as after a day of travel in the open country, I found who I was looking for. The mounted warrior appeared out of nowhere, blaring his ridiculous horn at me. When it was clear that he wouldn't stop, and was going to charge past me, I drew a haunt siphon to stop him in his tracks. It wasn't exactly diplomatic, I admit, and it meant that the following conversation had a bit of a cumbersome inception. Regardless, we spoke. I only managed a brief interview with the Warborn before he flew past me again, after the emptiness of my threat became apparent. Well, some of my questions were answered by the ghost, but others had to be confirmed with observation. The most important thing I learnt from that first encounter was his rank. As far as it was concerned, it was the first officer of the 13th Expeditionary Brotherhood, and that it was late, and couldn't afford such a meaningless, though admittedly flattering, distraction. In the days that followed, I began to track the movements of the Warborn ghost. This was tricky, as the creatures tend to become invisible when they're more than a stone's throw away. That said, they are present in more ways than just sight. As I determined, all Warborn radiate a coppery smell that lingers in spite of their passage. As such, I imbibed tonic to heighten my olfactory senses, so that even when the first officer was not present, I could determine where he had been and when he was coming. Each time that we ran afoul of one another, the ethereal spirit didn't seem to recognize me. Well, not fully, at least. It was sad, really. Though I guess that's the point. The creature seemed pained by recollection, as though it only had so much memory to afford the likes of me. It spoke in a way that seemed irritable, agitated, as well as arrogant and desperate. Between our encounters, I continued to follow its trail, and soon I came upon a more familiar sight. All along the mountain slopes that gently caress the Catsfield expanse are the scars of the Great Burning. I remember when you told me of that story, Lex. How the Triandane had burned the Catsfield Greatwood in their retreat, so as to incite a horde of werewolves that might stall the armies of mankind, and in doing so, they succeeded in slaying a princeling. Those battle slopes form a chain that runs the length of the Catsfield spine. I moved through nearly 12 separate battlefields, each one of them home to innumerable Warborn ghosts. The first officer I had encountered wasn't charging through the open landscape on some maddened jaunt. Every morning he would manifest in the same space at the far north of the Catsfield slopes, and over the course of the day he would race through the foothills, moving from battlefield to battlefield until the day's end, all to be repeated again when dawn broke upon the escarpment. It was after I conducted these observations that I then realized who this man was, or at least who he appeared to be. The first officer of the 13th Expeditionary Brotherhood, well, he was Rancor Tyrannis, the Red Cockerel. I remember him from your lessons. He, a single officer, had compounded mankind's defeat upon the Catsfield slopes. King Adarsis had lost a son on those slopes, and our forces were retreating. But Rancor, he was late. He had fallen out of pace with the greater host, and so while the forces of the king retreated, Rancor had missed the order. He and his 13th Brotherhood and all their auxiliaries pushed on into the smote ruin of the forest. I remember. They pursued the Triandane, and Rancor, the rooster, vain enough to wear an eagle on his mantle, galloped from detachment to detachment to feign an active hand in a futile fight. He ran, never looking back at his men as they were torn apart by horrors. You'll have to remind me, Lex, but I do not recall how the Red Cockerel died, though I can guess. Regardless, after I realized who this phantom was, I pressed him for answers. I wanted to know how he had died, Was it a werewolf, or an unverdane arrow to the throat? Or did his horse tumble into a broken neck when blackened logs proved to be unstable footing? Did he abandon his men, or did he genuinely believe that he could win a fight that the king's own son had retreated from? Did he feel guilty? I had to know. After my final interview with the ghost, I stayed in Cathamhome for a week and consulted our accounts there. To my surprise, our understanding of the Warborn is thin. I suppose it makes sense when ferocious terrors like werewolves, pestars, and aswang command so much more of our attention. Our accounts cite the Warborn as reflections of those that have died in battle. But I don't think this is true. I would like to amend this understanding, and I'm hoping that you can help me with this, Lex. This manifestation wearing the trappings of Rancor Tyrannis, it might have resembled the first officer of the 13th, but it wasn't him. The Warborn I encountered couldn't fight. They have scarcely any understanding of whose faces they wear. Hell, they barely even notice when their marching hosts field soldiers of the opposing side. They aren't reflections of the dead, but they're approximations, reenactors going through the motions, creating a dramatization of a real-world experience. I wouldn't say their performances are meant as satire. I think it's more likely that they are purposefully and unconsciously inaccurate, so that bookworms like you, Lex, can be there to correct them, and thereby legitimize the truth. I remember what you told me of those conflicts, and I trust it more than I do the strange approximations of men like Rancor Tyrannis. I looked on those battlefields, and I spoke to the creatures wearing the warped faces of the dead, and I knew better. If that isn't a credit to your teaching, then nothing is. It made me think. Something wants us to remember these conflicts. There is some will or intention behind these manifestations. The ethereal spirits of this world aren't just creatures that we hunters are paid to slay. They exist for a reason. We aren't warriors, are we, Lex? We aren't monster slayers or knightly guardians protecting the common man from the supernatural. We aren't hunters. That is simply an operation within our greater concern. Our order is one of a scholarly disposition, grasping with the primordial truth. Our world has a will, be it the dreams of Kine, the singing bones of Akassus, Nerimniex, or something else. Something other. I can't say, but I'd like to know. I'm finishing up my business in the north, trying to get by and scrape together some funds for the journey home. I'll keep an ear out. I anticipate our order shall soon be addressed by the High King, regarding whatever troubles are racking Garthenland. Depending on what is said, I will make ready to return home, and you and I, Lex, can speak more of the Red Cockerel and the revelations of the world. Until then, I wish you well. With regards, Flores the Rook. I hope you enjoyed that. Here is the finished design of Rancor Tyrannis, First Officer of the 13th Expeditionary Brotherhood and the Red Cockerel of the Heriked campaign. Or at least, This is the apparition wearing the visage of the pontificating peacock that spelled the doom of his men on the slopes of the Catsfield foothills. I was split with this design, as my primary focus was to iterate further on the idea of the Warborn ghost, and represent the qualities that make them unique among the ethereal cast. I feel that the designs succeed in this area, but ultimately struggles to get across the idea that this manifestation is putting on a performance, unconsciously performing the character of Rancor without actually being him. It's very difficult to convey this thematic, and so, to compensate, I fluffed up the design, putting a lot more visual interest and flair to convey some of his characterization as an officer. His armour and uniform are immaculate, detailed, and visually interesting. An area that I feel this design achieves rather successfully is creating the sense that the armour being worn between Rancor and his mount is armour that is unique to the aesthetics of this world. An important part of this project is that I'm trying to establish this setting through its visuals, in such a way that it stands apart from other fantasy worlds. To this end, I dedicated a lot of time to the style of the armour being worn. Armour for a wealthy officer, such as Rancor Tyrannis, shouldn't be limited to functionality, as this is a man whose role in battle is to command and inspire his soldiers. His appearance should be impressive, even if that comes at the expense of safety. In life, Rancor had belonged to House Tyrannis, a powerful family whose claim to fame is their impressive military history and the impeccable training of its armies. The lords of House Tyrannis share kinship with their High King, and this is largely why their individual power and might has never compelled them to ambitions of ruling. They are recognised by their family crest, that being a black eagle set against a red field. Rancor Tyrannis and his floundering during the war had been a threat to the impenetrable reputation of House Tyrannis, especially in those early days when its numbers were few. Thankfully for the House, in those days, humanity had greater concerns than to spread gossip on the fumblings of one dead lordling. Rancor's design was made to evoke the aesthetics of his house, sporting feathers, beaks, and sharp, sleek shapes, reminiscent of the bird of prey seen on the Tyrannis banner. Motifs like this were a blessing, as they helped to unify Rancor's appearance with that of his horse, Indolend. The trouble with mounted characters, like Rancor and Indolend, is trying to balance the detail distribution of both designs so that they are complete characters in their own right, while also complementing each other in such a way that doesn't blur their readability. To this end, wherever the design of one character became too busy with small details, I would offset the overall read of the two characters by having the area of busy detail being set against an area of rest for the eye. I feel that this worked for the most part, and that Rancor and Indolend managed to appear not only readable, but visually consistent and appealing. Overall, I am satisfied with the design for this character, and feel that he works as a solid addition to the Warborn ghosts, carrying a lot of the fun design components that sets the Warborn apart from my other ethereal spirits. The main issue with Rancor is that he doesn't feel quite as pompous as I would like him to. If anything, he reads as quite a severe and intimidating character, by virtue of the deathly and supernatural elements typical of a Warborn ghost. That said, I could easily chalk this up to the fact that this isn't really Rancor, but a manifestation playing the role of Rancor, as part of a supernatural reenactment. Anyway, that's all for my ghost redesign for the time being. The Warborn are a faction with great... Anyway, that's all for my ghost redesign for the time being. The Warborn are a faction with a great deal of internal variety, as there are so many different types of peoples across Arthrome, and inevitably, ghosts will manifest to share their likeness. There are lots of creatures, like wyverns, the Yame tribes and Selkie folk, that possess strange and inhuman proportions, which would be so fun to represent as Warborn ghosts. However, I expect I'll tackle these at a later date. With that said, thank you for watching. If you have any suggestions or requests of things you'd like me to draw, you can leave me a note in the comments below. Thank you, and see you in the next one.